Before we begin today's presentation, here is a brief and unrelated word. Quite apart from today's subject, there is also a separate book series titled PSYOP Christianity, written by Ron Allen Curtis Ratzlaff, under the pen name The Awakened Hybrid. It is its own, entirely different investigation. That work stands on its own. Across 7 volumes, it examines historical anomalies in the origins of Christianity and makes the evidence-driven case that the faith was shaped deliberately by the Roman Empire. If that separate subject interests you, the complete series is available now on Amazon. Simply search PSYOP Christianity or scan the code on screen. Now, let us begin. Where we left the clock. In episode 1, we opened the case file on the man who built the calendar. We showed you Joseph Scaliger's biography, his patrons, his artificial Julian period, and the documented Renaissance forgeries Annius of Viterbo's fake Berosus, the donation of Constantine that prove the capability and the motive for large-scale chronological manipulation were real, proven, and used. We showed you Anatoly Fomenko's form code statistics, his dynasty duplication claims, and the honest scientific verdict. Real anomaly, unreplicated method, no comparably rigorous refutation. And we closed with the bridge we are now going to walk across. Somewhere between the 14th and the 17th centuries, a real, well-documented, civilization-threatening climate catastrophe, the Little Ice Age, struck the Northern Hemisphere at almost exactly the same historical window that Fomenko and Nosovsky propose for their so-called Great Horde, Empire, and that an entire online research community, working independently of any Russian academic, arrived at from a completely different direction and gave a different name, Tartaria. Tonight, we go looking for that empire's wreckage. We are going to walk through the specific physical evidence a self-taught independent researcher named David Ewing Jr. has spent years accumulating Arabic inscribed coinage scattered across a continent that supposedly never spoke Arabic. Star-shaped fortresses whose function nobody can fully explain, church towers that look suspiciously like industrial chimneys, and a numerological pattern he insists is a signature left behind by whoever rewrote the record. And we are going to hold every single one of those claims up against the same forensic light we used on Scaliger and Fomenko, because this investigation does not get to relax its standards just because the evidence gets stranger. If anything, it needs to tighten them. That forensic light points at Ewing himself too, before it points anywhere else tonight. He is an independent YouTube creator, and the standard economics of that medium advertising revenue tied directly to watch time and audience engagement, supplemented in this space by direct viewer support reward, exactly the kind of dramatic, boundary-pushing, endlessly generative claim that a cautious, hedged, we genuinely don't know video does not reward nearly as well. That is not an accusation that every claim he makes is manufactured for clicks. It is a plain acknowledgement that his incentive structure, like Scaliger's salary from the States of Holland, and Fomenko's decades of personal investment in his own theory shapes what gets produced and how boldly it gets asserted. And this investigation will name that incentive for Ewing exactly as plainly as it has named it for everyone else, before a single one of his claims is weighed on its actual evidence. The empire that textbooks never named, revisited. Recall the shape of the claim from episode 1. Fomenko and Nosovsky propose that a single vast empire, the Great Horde, capital first in Istanbul, later Moscow, actually occupied the historical space that our textbooks have split into 4 separate civilizations: the Roman Empire, the medieval Islamic Caliphate, the Chinese Empire, and the Empire of Charlemagne. Under this reconstruction, those 4 civilizations are not 4 different peoples in 4 different centuries. They are one civilization, recorded 4 times under 4 different names, because the copying, editing, and translating of the original record, whether through honest confusion or deliberate design, split one truth into 4 fictions. The online research community that independently converged on a strikingly similar shape of claim calls their proposed empire Tartaria after the historical term Tartary, which really was used by early modern European cartographers to label the vast, poorly understood expanse of Central Asia and Siberia on real, physical, surviving maps. This is worth pausing on, because it is the single most concrete, checkable anchor in the entire Tartaria hypothesis. The word Tartary is not invented. It appears repeatedly on genuine 17th and 18th century European maps, labeling a region whose internal history, government, and cities the mapmakers themselves frequently admit they do not have reliable information about. A blank or a vague label on a map is not proof of a hidden empire, but it is proof that European cartographers themselves at the time considered a huge swath of the Eurasian landmass to be an information void, which is precisely the kind of void a chronological cover-up would need to operate inside. Ewing's central claim: the Arabic artifacts of northeastern Europe. David Ewing Jr.'s most repeated and most visually concrete argument concerns the sheer volume of Arabic script material coins, crowns, ecclesiastical regalia recovered from archaeological contexts across northeastern Europe, Scandinavia, Germany, Russia, and Ukraine. His claim, stated as strongly as he states it in his own recorded material, is that the majority of such artifacts recovered from this region bear Arabic writing, and that he specifically identifies this writing as Quranic Arabic, rather than merely decorative Kufic styling. And he argues that this fact is systematically unlabeled in museums, casually walked past by visitors who have no idea what they are looking at, and, in his sharpest criticism, deliberately underplayed even by the online Tartaria research community itself, which he says is happy to show you the architecture of the supposed lost empire, while carefully avoiding the specifically Islamic textual content stamped directly onto its coinage. Here is where the forensic method this investigation has used from its first sentence requires us to separate a real, documented, mainstream fact from Ewing's much larger interpretive leap built on top of it. The real, documented, entirely mainstream fact is this: Islamic silver dirham coinage genuinely, extensively, uncontroversially circulated across Viking Age Scandinavia and the territories of Kievan Rus during the 9th through 11th centuries. This is not a fringe claim. It is standard numismatics, taught in university courses on Viking Age trade, and it results directly from the well-documented Volga trade route, which connected the Islamic Abbasid Caliphate's silver-rich territories to the Baltic and Scandinavian world through a chain of river systems and portage routes that Scandinavian merchants and raiders used for over 2 centuries. Hordes containing thousands of Abbasid, Samanid, and other Islamic dirhams have been excavated across Sweden, Russia, and the Baltic states, and this is treated by mainstream archaeology as one of the best documented, most extensively studied trade networks of the entire early medieval period. The scale here deserves to be stated in specific numbers, because specific numbers are exactly what separates a documented mainstream fact from a vague impression. The single largest Viking Age silver hoard ever discovered on Earth, the Spillings Horde, unearthed on the Swedish island of Gotland in 1999, contained over 14,000 individual silver coins weighing a combined 67 kilograms, the overwhelming majority of them Islamic dirhams, minted across the Abbasid Caliphate, buried sometime around the year 870 of the Common Era. Archaeological surveys of Arabic coin finds across the Volga River basin itself, at sites including Timerevo in the Yaroslavl district of Russia, have produced some of the richest concentrations of Arabic coinage found anywhere in Europe. And the historian Valentin Yanin's systematic study of these finds established that the earliest monetary system of Rus's Russia was itself directly built on the circulation of these North African and Middle Eastern dirhams, not merely influenced by them at the margins. Chess itself, the game, is documented by medieval trade historians to have traveled into Rus territory along this exact route, from Persia and Arabia through the Volga corridor, a small but telling detail, because a trade network significant enough to carry a board game from Baghdad to the Baltic across multiple river systems and portage routes is not a marginal, easily overlooked footnote in northeastern Europe's history. It is one of the central arteries of that history, and it is worth this investigation's plain acknowledgement that general audience education, which tends to teach Viking history as an isolated, self-contained Scandinavian story, badly underserves its own students by leaving out just how deeply and continuously that same Viking world was interconnected with the Islamic world to its south and east. One further, harder truth belongs in this account, because an honest investigation does not get to celebrate a trade network's cultural richness while silently editing out its darkest documented function. Mainstream historians of the Volga trade route are explicit and unambiguous on this point. The same river corridor that carried dirhams north also carried enslaved people south, in a well-documented Viking-era slave trade that moved captives, overwhelmingly women and children taken in raids across northeastern Europe into the Abbasid Caliphate's markets in exchange for the very silver Ewing's viewers see uncritically celebrated in museum cases today. This is not a detail the online Tartaria community tends to mention when it shows you a beautiful dirham recovered from a Scandinavian grave, and it should not be a detail this investigation omits either, because the full, honest shape of this trade network includes both the coinage worth admiring and the human cost that paid for it. So when Ewing says Arabic inscribed coinage is genuinely present in this region in significant quantity, he is telling the truth. Where his claim outruns the documented evidence is in three specific ways. First, the conventional dating of this Arabic coinage, the 9th through 11th centuries, is centuries earlier than his proposed Tartarian Empire, which he places in the same window Fomenko and Nosovsky propose, the 14th through 17th centuries. Second, mainstream numismatics has never claimed the quantity of this material represents the majority of all regalia and artifacts recovered from the region. It represents a well-documented but specific and bounded trade phenomenon, not the dominant character of the region's entire material culture. Third, and this is the point worth sitting with, the underlying kernel of Ewing's observation that a real, substantial, historically significant volume of Arabic inscribed material genuinely exists in a region that conventional popular history treats as purely Christian European is not a fabrication. It is a real fact that general audience history education genuinely does underplay, dressed up by Ewing into a much larger and more totalizing claim than the documented evidence supports. This is the single clearest example in this entire investigation of the pattern we must now name explicitly, because we will see it again and again, a true underappreciated fact, stretched past its actual evidentiary boundary into a considerably larger claim. The number 19, the weakest link in the chain. We now arrive at the piece of Ewing's evidentiary corpus that this investigation must treat with the least charity, because it earns the least. Across his extensive video catalogue, Ewing repeatedly points to the number 19 recurring in independently reported statistics from the First and Second World Wars, 19,000 Belgian soldiers wounded. 19 million women reported to have worked for wages during the Second World War. 19,000 Germans reported to have served in the Spanish Civil War. 19,000 British dead on the first day of the First World War, described as the worst single day in that army's history. He presents this recurrence as a statistical signature, evidence that fabricated or copy-pasted historical data was stamped with the same authorial number across supposedly unrelated national records, and he explicitly ties this to the Quran's own internally debated numerical structure, a claim popularized outside mainstream Quranic scholarship decades ago by Rashad Khalifa, treating the recurrence of 19 in Western war statistics as a kind of hidden counter-signature planted by whoever actually authored the record. Here is why this specific claim collapses the moment a working statistician looks at it, and why this investigation is obligated to say so as plainly as it has praised the stronger claims in this series. No systematic count was ever presented of how many World War statistics do not feature the number 19. This is the textbook signature of what statisticians call a multiple comparisons problem, and it is the same failure mode that produces every numerology claim ever made about anything. If you comb through an enormous historical corpus containing millions of individual reported figures, looking specifically for occurrences of one particular number, you will find that number appearing suspiciously often every single time, regardless of which number you had chosen to look for, because base rates guarantee it. Pick the number 7 and go looking through the same corpus. You would find 7 everywhere too. This is not evidence of design. It is evidence of a search process built to find exactly what it was looking for. Of every claim reviewed across the 2 episodes of this investigation so far, this is the one that most closely resembles what its harshest critics accuse this entire body of research of being, and it should be named as such without hedging. Unfalsifiable pattern matching, presented as forensic proof. It is worth pausing here to draw the sharpest possible contrast this series can offer, because the contrast itself is the entire methodological lesson of this episode. Episode 1 introduced you to a genuinely different kind of numerical anomaly. Robert Russell Newton, the head of NASA's own computer center for space navigation, publishing in 1977 a real, peer-reviewed, still unresolved discontinuity in the moon's calculated secular acceleration derived from 370 historical eclipse records, a finding presented to and debated by the British Academy of Sciences itself in 1972. Fomenko's response to that anomaly was to substitute a specific, named alternative chronology. Nikolai Morozov's revised eclipse dates into Newton's own published algorithm, and to report, transparently and reproducibly, that the anomalous discontinuity flattened into the smooth curve tidal physics predicts. Whatever you conclude about Fomenko's broader chronological program, that specific maneuver is testable, transparent about its method, and built on a real anomaly that a mainstream physicist himself first identified and could not fully explain. Ewing's number 19 is built on none of those 3 things. It has no published base rate denominator, no transparent substitution test, and no anomaly a mainstream authority independently flagged before Ewing went looking for it. Both claims involve a number. Only one of them involves a method. This is the difference. This entire investigation exists to teach its audience to recognize on sight, in any future piece of evidence, either mainstream or dissident sources, ever put in front of you again, the star thoughts. From Ewing's weakest claim, we turn to a piece of physical evidence that deserves a genuinely open hearing, because unlike the numerology, this evidence is architectural, photographable, and geographically distributed in a way that at least raises a fair question, even where the mainstream answer turns out to be the correct one. Starfort's fortifications built with angular, multi-pointed bastions rather than simple round or square walls exist across an enormous geographic range. the Mazagan fortress at El Jadida in Morocco, sites across India, sites across Poland, and hundreds more scattered across Europe, the Mediterranean, and beyond. Ewing catalogues these structures extensively, arguing that their geometric sophistication is inconsistent with the primitive building capacity conventionally attributed to their era, that a great many of them are sealed off from public access or have been converted to other users, obscuring whatever their original function actually was, and that their true purpose may have involved something beyond conventional artillery-era fortification, energy generation, resonance, or defensive functions tied, in his framing, to a lost, advanced civilization. Mainstream military architecture has a direct, thoroughly documented, entirely non-mysterious explanation for the star fort's geometry, and it must be stated plainly before this investigation goes any further. The star-shaped bastion design is a well-attested 15th through 17th century engineering response to the introduction and rapid improvement of gunpowder artillery. Round and square fortification walls of the medieval period created defensive dead zones, angles from which defenders could not bring fire to bear on an approaching enemy, and the angular, projecting bastion of the star fort design, known in the historical literature by its Italian name, the Trace Italienne, was engineered specifically to eliminate those dead zones, allowing defenders positioned in one bastion to support the adjacent bastion with covering fire along the wall face. This is not contested, fringe, or alternative history. It is the standard textbook account of early modern military engineering taught in every serious survey of the period, and it explains the star fort's geometry completely, without requiring any lost civilization, hidden empire, or exotic energy function whatsoever. And yet, and this is where a fair-minded investigation must resist the temptation to declare total victory for the conventional account and walk away, Ewing's genuinely under-examined questions do not fully dissolve, simply because his more speculative framing is wrong. Why are so many of these structures inaccessible to the public today? Why does the surrounding urban and economic context of some star forts seem disproportionate to their stated original defensive purpose, as though a fortification of that scale and precision was built to defend a settlement that, by the conventional record, was never large or strategically significant enough to warrant it? These are fair, answerable, investigable questions, and a serious historian should be able to answer them site by site without dismissing the questioner. Take Ewing's own lead example, the Mazagan fortress at El Jadida in Morocco, and answer the question directly rather than leaving it hanging as rhetorical ammunition. Mazagan is not an unexplained mystery structure. It is a documented Portuguese colonial fortification built beginning in 1514 and 1515 and substantially completed by 1541. One of the earliest and best preserved examples of European Renaissance military architecture constructed on the African continent, complete with a functioning cistern, a citadel, and churches serving the Portuguese garrison, who held it for over 2 centuries before ceding it to Morocco in 1769. The site is significant enough and well enough documented to have been formally inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site under the name Portuguese city of Mazagan, with a full published nomination dossier tracing its construction, its garrison records, and its architectural lineage back through named Portuguese Royal Engineers. This is not a structure sealed off from history's records because something is being hidden. It is a structure whose records are unusually complete, cited by UNESCO's own International Review Panel, standing as one of the best documented star forts on Earth rather than one of the least, where genuinely underdocumented or inaccessible star forts exist elsewhere in Ewing's broader catalogue, and some plausibly do Mazagan itself. The very example most frequently held up as emblematic of the whole category turns out to be the opposite of a mystery. The correct position for this investigation to hold is this. The star fort's geometry is fully and correctly explained by gunpowder-era military engineering. The star fort's specific pattern of public inaccessibility and occasional mismatch with its surrounding settlements' documented economic importance is a genuinely open, case-by-case question that deserves real answers rather than either conspiratorial speculation or reflexive dismissal. Because this investigation just made a confident mainstream claim, it owes you the actual documented history behind it, not merely the assertion that one exists. The oldest known star-shaped fortification identified by military historians is the Yedikule fortress in Constantinople, built in 1458 under the victorious Ottoman Sultan who had just taken the city 5 years earlier, using precisely the kind of massive siege cannon that was about to make every medieval curtain wall on Earth obsolete. The design's more famous flowering, however, happened in Italy, in direct, documented, chronologically precise response to a specific military crisis, the French invasion of the Italian peninsula beginning in 1494, during what historians call the Italian Wars, in which French siege trains equipped with newly mobile bronze cannon and bombards tore through fortifications that had stood effectively unbreached for centuries. Italian engineers watched medieval defenses fall in days that should have held for months, and the Trace Italienne was their documented, engineered answer. Michelangelo Buonarroti himself, better known to history for the Sistine Chapel ceiling, personally designed defensive earthworks for the fortification of Florence, using exactly this bastion geometry, a fact any serious biography of the artist records without controversy. The design was further refined by the architects Baldassare Peruzzi and Vincenzo Scamozzi across the 16th century and spread out of Italy specifically in the 1530s and 1540s, exported by Italian military engineers who were, quite literally, hired across the continent as the era's most in-demand defense contractors. It reached its most elaborate, most mathematically refined form in the late 17th century in the hands of the Dutch engineer Menno van Cohoorn and, above all, Sébastien Leprestre de Vauban, chief military engineer to Louis XIV of France, whose fortress designs added ravelins, redoubts, counterguards, hornworks, and a dozen other named defensive elements to the basic bastion until, in the words of one architectural historian, a fortress had acquired more specialized named parts than a warship. This is, in short, one of the most thoroughly, precisely, name and date documented design lineages in the entire history of military architecture, a fact that makes it an unusually strong example of exactly the kind of claim this investigation wants its audience to recognize. Real, checkable, mainstream history that is nonetheless genuinely astonishing to learn, requiring no hidden empire to be worth your attention. Churches or power plants. Ewing's most concrete visual argument, and the one this investigation finds most worth putting in front of an audience precisely because it can be checked, concerns a comparison between the towers, steeples, and minarets of religious buildings and the industrial chimney stacks of documented 19th century mills and power stations. Ewing repeatedly presents pre-restoration photographs, often around a century old, of specific structures, Quarrybank Mill in Cheshire, England, and Battersea Power Station in London, among his named comparisons, arguing that the tall masonry stacks of these confirmed industrial buildings are visually near identical to the towers found on churches across Europe and on minarets across the Islamic world, and that domes and ornamental caps were added on top of what were originally plain industrial chimneys sometime after the photographs he cites were taken, converting disused industrial infrastructure into structures later reclassified as places of worship. He extends the same comparison to a minaret in India, holding a modern photograph against an older one of the same structure, and to Ottoman-era buildings in Thessaloniki, arguing that surviving photographs of buildings destroyed in the First World War show chimneys, not the minarets. Those buildings are conventionally described as having had. He connects this to a specific Quranic textual claim, that the Quran describes King Solomon constructing large reservoir and cistern structures, and what Ewing interprets as boiling stations, corroborating textual evidence, in his reading, that certain domed and towered buildings were originally industrial heating or energy infrastructure before being reclassified as religious architecture. The comparison itself is genuinely striking to look at, and this investigation is not going to pretend otherwise for the sake of false balance. A tall vertical masonry shaft is, functionally, a tall vertical masonry shaft, whether it was built to vent a furnace or to house a bell, and the two purposes produce structures that a period's shared regional building materials and shared engineering vocabulary will naturally cause to resemble one another. That is the honest, non-conspiratorial explanation mainstream architectural history offers, and it accounts for a great deal of the visual similarity Ewing presents without requiring any hidden industrial history whatsoever. What this investigation cannot honestly tell you is that Ewing's specific photographic comparisons have been independently verified against a dated, archived, citable source. The images he presents were exchanged privately in his own recorded conversations, without reference to a specific archive, and no independent verification of the specific claimed dates for the minaret cap addition in India, or the specific claimed chimney versus minaret identification in the Thessaloniki photographs, was located anywhere in the material reviewed for this investigation. This is, in other words, a vivid, worth-showing visual argument resting on unverified specific photographic claims layered on top of a real, general, and honestly explicable architectural pattern, precisely the kind of evidence this series exists to place before its audience, with the caveats stated plainly rather than either suppressed or oversold. It is worth spending one more moment on the two named buildings themselves, because their real, fully documented histories are instructive in a way that cuts cleanly against Ewing's specific framing, even while leaving his general visual observation intact. Quarrybank Mill in Cheshire, England, is not a disputed or reclassified structure of any kind. It is a cotton mill built in 1784 by the documented industrialist Samuel Gregg, powered originally by a water wheel on the River Bowlin and preserved today, tower and chimney included, as a National Trust historic site with a complete, continuous, uninterrupted paper trail of ownership, use, and construction records stretching from its founding to the present day. Battersea Power Station in London is equally undisputed. Construction began in 1929. Its distinctive 4 white chimneys were completed in stages across the 1930s and again after the Second World War, and it operated as a coal-fired electricity generating station supplying London's grid until its final decommissioning in 1983. Its entire operational history documented in London's own municipal power records. Neither building has ever been the subject of a reclassification dispute, a disputed original purpose, or a missing chapter in its ownership record. What this means for Ewing's argument is precise and worth stating plainly. The industrial side of his visual comparison is rock-solid, fully documented history, which is exactly why the comparison photographs look as compelling as they do a genuinely well-documented 19th century chimney really does share the same tall masonry shaft engineering silhouette as a church tower or minaret of the same general era. For the entirely mundane architectural reason this investigation has already given you, the compelling visual similarity is real. The claim that the religious buildings were secretly the industrial ones, retrofitted after the fact, remains the part of the argument with no comparable documentary record standing behind it. A second forger, by the same method episode 1 used on the first. Before this episode leaves the Renaissance and turns to the mud flood, this investigation owes its audience a second documented case of exactly the kind of manuscript fabrication episode 1 built its entire opening argument around with Annius of Viterbo, because a pattern proven once is a curiosity, and a pattern proven twice by two different scholars in two different countries using two different methods starts to look like the actual operating condition of the age rather than an isolated criminal exception. Gianfrancesco Poggio Bracciolini, born in 1380 in the Republic of Florence, was one of the most celebrated manuscript hunters of the entire early Renaissance, serving for decades as a papal secretary with the access, the Latin fluency, and the personal ambition to travel the monastic libraries of Germany, Switzerland, and France, hunting for classical texts everyone assumed had been lost forever. His genuine, well-documented, uncontested discoveries are extraordinary in their own right and do not need a single conspiracy theory to be worth admiring. He recovered the sole surviving manuscript of Lucretius's philosophical poem on the nature of things from a German monastery in 1417, rescuing the only surviving copy of one of the most important works of ancient materialist philosophy from what was, by his own account, near total obscurity. He recovered Vitruvius's On Architecture, the foundational text of the entire Renaissance architectural revival that produced everything from Michelangelo's fortifications to Peruzzi's churches. He recovered lost orations of Cicero, the complete text of Quintilian's Institutio Oratoria, and works by Ammianus Marcellinus, Statius, and Silius Italicus. Every serious history of Renaissance humanism, without exception, credits Poggio as one of the single most important recoverers of the classical inheritance the entire European Renaissance was built on top of. And also, seriously, credentialed scholars have argued for over a century and a half that at least one of his celebrated finds may not be a recovery at all, but a fabrication, and the specific text in question could not be more consequential for this investigation's purposes, because it is Tacitus's Annals, one of the single most important surviving sources for the entire history of the early Roman Empire, the text underlying much of what a modern reader believes they know about the reigns of Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. The case for outright forgery was made at length by the 19th century scholar John Wilson Ross in a book published in 1878 under the direct title Tacitus and Bracciolini. The Annals forged in the X-th century and revisited again in the 20th century by Louis Paretz, The Annals of Poggio Bracciolini, and Other Forgeries. The argument, in its strongest documented form, rests on stylistic analysis, that the Latin prose style of the Annals, examined closely, bears distinctive similarities to Poggio's own known 15th century Latin composition, similarities its defenders say are coincidental products of a shared classical education, and its critics say are the fingerprint of a single author writing in two different registers 5 centuries apart from each other, only on paper. This investigation is not going to tell you the Ross-Parrott forgery thesis is the settled mainstream position, because it is not the overwhelming majority of classical scholars today still treat Tacitus's Annals as a genuine first-century composition, and the manuscript tradition connecting Poggio's recovered copy to an older, independently attested textual lineage is considerably stronger than the manuscript tradition Annius of Viterbo could ever produce for his invented Berosus. What this investigation will tell you, plainly, is this. The fact that a serious, published, sourced, scholarly argument exists, not a fringe YouTube claim, but a documented 19th century monograph and a documented 20th century follow-up questioning the authenticity of one of the single most load-bearing texts in the entire historical record of the early Roman Empire, is itself exactly the kind of fact a chronology-skeptical investigation exists to surface. You do not have to accept Ross and Parrott's conclusion to recognize that the same man, in the same decades, working in the same manuscript hunting profession that produced Annius's proven fake Berosus, has a live, published, unresolved authenticity question hanging over one of his own most historically consequential finds. 2 documented cases, not one, sit inside this single generation of Renaissance manuscript recovery. 1 proven forgery and 1 seriously disputed case still argued today, and an honest jury weighing tonight's evidence about Tartaria and the Great Horde should carry both cases forward, long à long, exactly as it carries forward everything else this investigation has shown you rather than simply asserted. The mud flood. We now arrive at the claim that ties this entire episode most directly back into the Little Ice Age bridge Episode 1 left us with. The Tartaria research community's core catastrophist claim, stated most directly in a documentary this investigation reviewed in full, is this. A planet-spanning apocalyptic catastrophe produced a great mudflood that destroyed a worldwide empire, and that empire's subsequent recovery was not a renaissance, not a rebirth, but a reset, a deliberate rewriting of history that hid what had actually happened, renamed the empire so its true identity could not be traced, and never rebuilt it under its original name. The documentary connects this to a claimed pattern of recurring megastorms occurring roughly every 200 years, manifesting as floods, droughts, and dust storms, and cites specific, real, photographically documented 19th century American flood and dust storm events, a widely circulated historical photograph of Sacramento, California, flooded as far as the eye can see, tied to documented electrical infrastructure damage as evidence of the pattern's continuation into the modern record. The 19th century American flood and dust storm record cited here is genuinely real and genuinely well documented by mainstream climate history, and this deserves to be stated with full confidence. Catastrophic flooding events like the Great Flood of 1862 in California, and later the Dust Bowl droughts of the 1930s, are uncontested, extensively studied events sitting at the tail end of the same broad climatic volatility. This investigation has already tied to the Little Ice Age's documented instability across the 17th through 19th centuries. The suggestion that these recurring severe weather events, rather than being independent occurrences, might represent expressions of the same underlying longer climatic pattern is a legitimate, testable hypothesis about paleoclimatology, not an outlandish claim. Where the documentary's specific supporting anecdotes move into territory this investigation cannot verify. A claimed case of a so-called Mormon island buried by an 1830s flood in a California lake, later partially exposed, with masonry alleged to resemble a shared, globally distributed Tartarian construction style, and a claimed case of a church in Venezuela deliberately buried behind a dam to hide it, said to have survived an attempted demolition by dynamite. Neither of these specific claims was independently sourced to a citable archive, geological survey, or news record during this investigation's research. They should be presented to you honestly as unverified narrative claims offered by the documentary as illustrative evidence, not as documented findings while the broader point they are illustrating, that catastrophic, civilization-altering flooding really has recurred across the historical record with a severity most popular history badly underplays, remains genuinely well supported by the parts of this claim that are independently checkable. The general crisis. Mainstream historiography already agrees something broke. Before this investigation moves further into contested territory, it owes its audience one piece of genuinely mainstream, peer-reviewed historiography that independently supports the core intuition behind the mud flood and catastrophist claims, without requiring a single one of their more speculative details. Historians call it the general crisis, and it is not a fringe theory. British historian Eric Hobsbawm first proposed a 17th century economic crisis in 1954. The term itself was coined 5 years later by the conservative Oxford historian Hugh Trevor Roper, describing a widespread, roughly simultaneous breakdown in the relationship between society and the state across much of Western Europe in the middle decades of the 1600s. Since then, the concept has been extended and refined by mainstream academic historians, most substantially by Jeffrey Parker of Yale University, whose book Global Crisis, War, Climate Change, and Catastrophe in the 17th Century, published by Yale University Press, and his companion peer-reviewed article in the American Historical Review argue the crisis was not confined to Europe at all, but struck simultaneously across Eurasia, driven substantially by the same climatic downturn this series has already introduced, the Little Ice Age, intensified in this specific window by the Maunder Minimum, a documented, decades-long collapse in sunspot activity that reduced solar output across almost exactly the crisis period. The specific, mainstream documented toll is not abstract. The 30 Years' War, fought across Central Europe from 1618 to 1648, killed a substantial fraction of the population of the German-speaking lands through direct violence, famine, and disease, compounding crop failures that were themselves driven by the colder, wetter growing seasons the Little Ice Age produced. England underwent civil war and regicide in the same decades. Ming China's collapse in 1644 coincided with severe, well-documented droughts and famines now tied by climate historians to the same global cooling pattern. This is not this investigation's own synthesis, stretched to fit a thesis. It is the explicit, published argument of tenured historians working through Yale University Press and a flagship peer-reviewed historical journal, arguing that a real climatic catastrophe helped drive a real, near-simultaneous, multi-continent collapse of political order in the 17th century. Parker's own case, in the specific detail his book and article lay out, does not stop at Europe and China. He documents failed harvests and famine conditions recorded across Ottoman Anatolia in the same decades, contributing to a wave of peasant rebellions known to Ottoman historians as the Selali revolts. He documents the Mughal Empire in India, recording some of the worst famines in its own chronicled history during this identical window. He documents Japan's Tokugawa shogunate, newly consolidated after its own long civil war, imposing strict isolationist and internal control policies during these same decades. Policies, Parker argues, were shaped in part by the same subsistence pressures straining every other major Eurasian state simultaneously. The sheer geographic breadth of Parker's documented evidence, Western Europe, the Ottoman world, Mughal India, Ming, and then Qing China, Tokugawa Japan, all recording severe subsistence crises and major political rupture within the same 50-year window, is precisely the kind of near-simultaneous worldwide catastrophe the Tartaria community's mudflood narrative gestures toward. Except Parker's version comes with tree ring data, tax records, and a Yale University Press imprint behind it, rather than an anonymous documentary narrator's voice. This matters enormously for how this investigation's audience should weigh everything else in this episode. It means the Tartaria community's and Fomenko's underlying intuition that something genuinely catastrophic happened to global civilization during the broad window this series keeps returning to, something severe enough to plausibly explain widespread social rupture, population loss, and the kind of institutional scrambling that produces both genuine chronicle confusion and deliberate historical revision is not a fringe intuition invented by internet forums. It is one mainstream academic historians have already argued, using climate data, tax records, and casualty counts in peer-reviewed print. Where this investigation parts ways with the more speculative Tartaria claims is not on whether a catastrophe happened. The general crisis literature settles that question honestly, on real evidence, but on the specific, unproven mechanisms, a single erased global empire, a deliberately engineered reset, a 200-year megastorm cycle layered on top of a genuine climatic and political catastrophe that mainstream historiography already, independently, takes seriously when real science gets borrowed. Before we leave the Tartaria material behind, one more source deserves mention, precisely because of how instructive its failures are. A companion piece of Tartaria-adjacent video content opens with the Alvarez hypothesis, the real, mainstream, well-documented scientific finding that a thin layer of the element iridium found worldwide at the geological boundary between the Cretaceous and Paleogene periods provides strong evidence for the asteroid impact now understood to have caused the extinction of the dinosaurs. This is genuine, citable, settled, mainstream science. The video then extends this real foundation into a chain of considerably more speculative claims that Crusader Knights' full-body armor may have functioned as protection against electromagnetic radiation, rather than, or in addition to, conventional weapons, and folklore about small, technologically sophisticated underground survivor populations recovering from a cataclysm, citing real mycologist Paul Stamets' genuine published work on fungal intelligence and Michael Pollan's genuine mainstream book on the co-evolutionary relationship between maize and human civilization as supporting texture along the way. This is worth naming as its own distinct pattern, separate from every other pattern this investigation has already identified, because it is subtler and, in its way, more concerning. It is not a true fact stretched past its evidentiary limit the way the Arabic artifact claim was. It is real, credentialed, peer-reviewed science, the Alvarez hypothesis, Stamets mycology, Pollan's agricultural history, deployed as a credibility bridge to usher an audience toward claims that share none of that science's actual evidentiary support. Watch for this pattern. It is one of the most common rhetorical structures in speculative history content, and naming it here equips you to recognize it the next time you encounter it in this investigation's own material or anyone else's. Whose history gets written? China's 19th century. We turn now from the physical evidence of a possibly hidden empire to a case study that requires no revisionist chronology at all, and that is precisely its value. The claim, 19th century China's history, as generally taught, centers a narrative of Western powers heroically opening up a backward, isolated empire to trade, and this narrative, examined honestly, is a self-serving euphemism for a much uglier and thoroughly documented reality. The First Opium War, 1839 to 1842, and the Second, 1856 to 1860, were fought by Britain, and then Britain, together with France, specifically to force the Qing government to accept the opium trade, after that government had confiscated and destroyed British-owned opium stocks in an explicit act of drug prohibition. China lost both wars. Hong Kong, the Kowloon Peninsula, and Stonecutters Island were ceded to Britain. Outer Manchuria was ceded to Russia, and China was compelled to legalize the very trade its own government had tried to prohibit. There is no honest reading of this sequence of events that supports the phrase opening up to trade as a neutral description. It is a war fought to protect a drug trafficking operation, won by the traffickers and remembered in the passive, sanitizing voice that every institution with something to hide eventually learns to use. The specific treaty terms deserve to be named because they are the plainest possible evidence of what this war actually was. The Treaty of Nanjing, signed in 1842, ending the First War, forced China to pay a war indemnity of 21 million silver dollars, to open 5 treaty ports to British trade and residence, and to grant British subjects the legal privilege of extraterritoriality, meaning British citizens on Chinese soil answered only to British law, not Chinese law, a privilege later extended to other Western powers under the so-called unequal treaties framework that historians of the period use without any dispute at all. The Second Opium War's Treaty of Tientsin and the subsequent Convention of Peking went further still, legalizing the opium trade outright, opening additional ports, and permitting foreign legations to be established directly inside Beijing itself. This is the documentary record standing behind the phrase, opening up to trade, a phrase that, read against the actual treaty text it is meant to summarize, describes a coerced, unequal, extraterritorial trading arrangement imposed at gunpoint to protect a narcotics business, not a story of two civilizations meeting as equals in a marketplace. The Taiping Rebellion, 1850 to 1864, killed tens of millions of people in what stands as very plausibly the bloodiest conflict on earth during the entire 19th century. A figure Western general audience education rarely places alongside the far smaller, far more extensively taught death tolls of contemporary European wars. The rebellion's leader, Hong Xiuquan, built a syncretic movement drawing explicitly on Christian influence, and for a time welcomed Western missionaries as, in his own movement's language, brothers and sisters from overseas. Western opinion on the rebellion was genuinely divided, and ultimately the Western powers present in China chose to back the weakening Qing imperial court against the rebellion, providing direct military support. The court that Western commercial interests found it convenient to prop up was not, in this telling, a noble ancient civilization graciously tolerating foreign merchants. It was a client regime, kept upright because its survival served foreign interests better than its collapse would have. And the Boxer Rebellion, 1899 to 1901, was explicitly, unambiguously, an anti-foreign, anti-missionary uprising, not primarily a conflict between nations, but a domestic Chinese response to the accumulated decades of foreign, commercial, religious, and military intrusion the two conflicts just described had already established. It was crushed by the eight-nation alliance: Britain, Russia, Japan, France, Germany, the United States, Italy, and Austria-Hungary, an extraordinary coalition of 8 separate world powers jointly invading a sovereign nation to protect their own citizens and missionaries, in one of history's rarer displays of imperial powers, setting aside their own rivalries to jointly discipline a colonized population. China was made to pay a crushing indemnity afterward. The Qing court's own position throughout the crisis was genuinely fractured. The Empress Dowager Cixi, at points, ordered her own forces to protect the besieged foreign legations, while conservative factions within her own court simultaneously fired on those same legations, meaning even the simplified textbook version of the Boxers versus the West flattens a far messier reality in which China's own imperial government was not remotely unified. None of this requires Fomenko's statistics, or Ewing's Arabic coinage, or a single mudflood. It requires only the plain, uncontested documentary record of the 19th century, read without the euphemisms that opening up to trade and backward empire have supplied for a century and a half. If the elite institutions this investigation has spent 2 episodes examining are capable of quietly retiring the memory of drug wars, propped-up client courts, and 8-nation punitive invasions behind a phrase as anodyne, as opening up to trade within living historical memory, in the age of the printing press, the telegraph, and photographic documentation, the burden of proof for believing those same kinds of institutions handled the deeper, less documented past with greater honesty grows lighter with every additional century you ask it to carry. The social engineering thesis. There is one more strand of Ewing's argument that deserves its own hearing, because it is the strand that most directly ties his historical claims to a claim about the present. Ewing links his proposed chronological fabrication to a broader argument about deliberate social engineering, that the 20th century's mass mobilization of women into wage labor was, in his framing, less a matter of economic necessity than a deliberate program of wartime myth-making designed to weaken traditional family structures, that modern university placement and admission systems deliberately relocate students away from their home cities, specifically to atomize kinship networks, and that both of these mechanisms serve a broader power structure that benefits from a population that is historically disoriented, economically dependent, and stripped of the dense extended family networks that once made resistance to centralized authority practical. Separate the claim's components because they carry very different evidentiary weight. Ewing's connection of this thesis to the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the broader architecture of debt-based development lending is not speculative fringe material. It draws directly on the real, mainstream published whistleblower account of John Perkins, a former economic consultant whose book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, was published in 2004, spent months on the New York Times bestseller list, and has since been updated and reissued with additional documented case studies. Perkins's own account, told in the first person, describes his professional role generating deliberately inflated economic growth projections for developing nations, projections used to justify large infrastructure loans those nations' own economies had no realistic capacity to repay, with the specific, stated purpose of trapping the borrowing nation into long-term financial and, ultimately, political dependency on the lending institutions and the countries that controlled them. Perkins names specific countries, specific projects, and specific outcomes in his own book, and while some of his more sensational personal claims about extrajudicial killings tied to the same period have drawn skepticism even from reviewers otherwise sympathetic to his broader economic argument, the core mechanism he describes that development lending has functioned, in a well-documented number of cases, as a tool of continued economic control rather than good-faith development assistance, is a genuine and well-corroborated pattern of international finance capital, extracting compliance from developing nations through engineered debt dependency. This is documented, citable, and taken seriously by mainstream critics of international development policy. It is not something Ewing invented. What remains far more speculative and unsupported by any comparable documentary record is the specific claim that university admissions policies and mid-century female workforce participation were coordinated instruments of the same deliberate program. Rather than the more conventional explanations, mainstream sociology and economic history offer genuine wartime labor shortages, the documented post-war expansion of higher education access, and the ordinary logistics of a growing university system needing to distribute a fixed number of admission slots across a growing number of applicants, the debt colonization claim stands on real ground. The family atomization claim does not currently stand on comparable ground. and this investigation will not pretend the two claims are equally supported simply because they arrive from the same speaker in the same breath. The verdict of Episode 2. One closing item belongs here before the verdict because it directly answers a question a careful viewer has likely been holding since this episode's opening minutes. What concretely does this investigation think actually happened to the surface world during the centuries the general crisis literature and the Little Ice Age both independently document as catastrophic? The honest answer is not a single empire's fall, and not a single reset event. It is a slower, messier, better documented process. Repeated regional famines, repeated currency debasements as strained treasuries across Europe and Asia devalued their coinage to cover war costs. Repeated waves of migration as populations fled failed harvests, and repeated genuine chronicle confusion as monasteries and administrative centers were abandoned, burned, or simply lost continuity of record-keeping during decades of war and plague. This is not a story that requires a hidden global empire to explain why so much of the 14th through 17th centuries documentary record is thinner, more contradictory, and harder to reconstruct than either the centuries before or after it. Mainstream historians of the period already describe this exact combination of factors: climatic stress, war, plague, administrative breakdown, as sufficient on its own to produce genuine gaps and confusions in the historical record, entirely without requiring anyone to have deliberately engineered a cover-up. Where this investigation parts ways with the purely conventional account is only in refusing to assume, as a matter of unexamined faith, that every one of those genuine gaps was filled back in afterward with perfect honesty by the specific institutions that had the most to gain from filling them in favorably to themselves. Weigh what we have actually established tonight, sorted honestly by strength, exactly as Episode 1's verdict was sorted. The word Tartary genuinely appears on real historical maps, marking a genuine information void European cartographers themselves acknowledged. Islamic dirham coinage, genuinely, extensively circulated across northeastern Europe through a well-documented medieval trade network, even though its dating and its claimed scope do not match Ewing's proposed empire. The Starfort's geometry is fully and correctly explained by gunpowder-era military engineering, even as legitimate, unanswered questions remain about specific sites' public inaccessibility. The 19th century American flood and dust storm record is real, extensively documented climate history, even where specific anecdotes built on top of it a buried Mormon island, a dynamited Venezuelan church, remain unverified. 19th century China's actual history, stripped of its sanitizing euphemisms, independently and powerfully demonstrates that institutions with something to protect really do shape how catastrophic, embarrassing history gets remembered, a demonstration that requires no revisionist chronology at all to be devastating on its own terms. And the number 19, standing entirely alone among everything reviewed tonight, does not survive contact with basic statistical reasoning, and this investigation will not pretend otherwise for the sake of a tidier narrative. The Poggio Bracciolini authenticity question, real, published, argued by named scholars across 2 centuries, stands as this episode's clearest reminder that even the most celebrated recoverers of the classical inheritance operated inside a manuscript economy where authenticity could not always be independently verified at the time, and sometimes still cannot be fully verified today. The Star Fort's engineering history, traced from Yedicule in 1458 through Michelangelo's Florentine earthworks to Vauban's court-commissioned fortresses for Louis XIV, stands as this episode's clearest reminder that a genuinely mysterious-looking architectural pattern can have an entirely mundane, thoroughly documented explanation, and that the correct response to encountering such a pattern is not automatic suspicion, but the willingness to go check. The Volga trade route's dirham hordes, its chess sets carried from Baghdad to the Baltic, and its darker, less frequently mentioned traffic in enslaved captives moving the opposite direction, stand as this episode's clearest reminder that the most historically rich, most genuinely underserved by general education stories are rarely purely celebratory or purely damning. They are usually both at once, and an honest investigation reports both halves rather than the flattering half alone. The general crisis literature's tree-ring data, tax records, and casualty counts spanning from the Ottoman Salali revolts to Ming China's collapse to the English Civil War, stand as this episode's clearest reminder that mainstream, peer-reviewed academic history is fully capable of documenting a genuine, near-simultaneous, multi-continent catastrophe, when the evidence actually supports one, meaning the correct response to any future claim of hidden global catastrophe is neither automatic belief nor automatic dismissal, but the same question this entire series keeps returning to. What does the specific, checkable evidence actually show once you go and look at it yourself? That is the honest shape of the evidence. Real gaps in the documentary record, real unexplained architecture, real documented catastrophe, real institutional self-interest in how history gets told bundled, inevitably, with genuine overreach, unverifiable specifics, and at least one claim that should never have been presented as forensic proof in the first place. Notice, too, what this episode's own sourcing has just done to itself, because it is worth naming out loud rather than leaving implicit. This investigation has now applied its harshest scrutiny not only to Ewing, an independent creator with an admitted incentive to dramatize, but to Fomenko, to the documentary narrators behind the mudflood claim, and, in this very episode, to 2 celebrated pillars of the mainstream historical canon, Poggio Bracciolini's manuscript recoveries, and the sanitized textbook language surrounding 19th century China. A jury that only cross-examines the witnesses it is already inclined to distrust is not a jury at all. It is a verdict looking for a trial to attach itself to. An honest jury does not acquit the whole case because one witness lied. It also does not convict on the strength of a witness who told the truth about several other things. It weighs each claim on its own evidence, exactly as this investigation has tried to do across 2 episodes now, and it carries the strongest of tonight's claims forward into episode 3, where the investigation turns east into Armenia, into Khazaria, and into a set of manuscripts that may preserve the memory of a Semitic world. Our official record buried beneath one single, later competing national narrative. Carry that discipline with you into what follows, because episode 3 will need it more than any episode so far. It travels into territory where the evidence is thinner, the sources more esoteric, and the temptation to let a compelling framework substitute for a documented fact is stronger than anywhere this investigation has gone yet. The same standard applies there that has applied here. Real manuscripts, named scholars, dated editions, and a plain, stated line between what the documentary record actually shows and what a modern interpretive framework has chosen to build on top of it. That standard has not failed this investigation yet, across a Renaissance forger, a Soviet mathematician, and an independent YouTube creator alike, and there is no reason to abandon it now, simply because the terrain ahead grows stranger than a mud flood, a star fort, or a 500-year-old manuscript dispute. End of episode 2. Continue to episode 3, Urartu, Khazaria, and the Hidden Semitic World. This presentation was produced by Creatic Media, a veteran-owned digital studio. We build production-grade progressive web apps and custom software. Our own trivia platform, Muse Ion Trivia, shows exactly what we can deliver for your business. We also offer fully built business websites and ready-to-launch templates, from done-for-you sites to affordable starter designs. We also create marketing commercials using localized on-premise AI, giving small businesses broadcast quality ads for a fraction of the cost of a full marketing team. And because everything runs on our own hardware, your project never touches a remote data center. Your data stays private. Visit creaticmedia.com to start your project today. That concludes episode 2 of Renaissance Reinvention. Stay tuned for episode 3, where our investigation continues into Armenia and Khazaria. We will see you there.